Have you ever felt like you've promised yourself something, to finally speak English fluently, to never give up again, and then broke that promise quietly when no one was watching? This video is my story. It's about how I broke my own promise in Denmark, how shame almost silenced me, and how I learned that broken promises don't always mean broken people. Sometimes, they're the beginning of something stronger.
The promise I broke. When I first arrived in Denmark, I made a promise to myself. I'll speak English confidently every single day, no matter what. Sounded noble. It felt powerful. But just a few months later, I broke that promise, quietly like a thief stealing his own hope. It began in a supermarket. I wanted to ask where the bread was. Simple, right? But the words froze somewhere between my brain and my tongue. My heartbeat got loud, my palms got sweaty, and I ended up just pointing silently at the shelf. That night, I told myself it was nothing. Next time will be easier. But the next time never came, not for weeks. The truth is, promises are easy when you're comfortable. But when you're scared, lonely, and surrounded by people who speak faster than your thoughts, your brain starts whispering, maybe it's better not to try. That's when my first real English lesson began. Not about grammar, but about courage. You see, breaking a promise doesn't happen in one big moment. It dies in small excuses. I'm tired. I'll practice tomorrow. It's just not my day. Each one sounds harmless, but together they build a quiet prison. And in that prison, your confidence slowly disappears. But here's the part no one tells you. Breaking a promise can also be the start of understanding yourself. It's not always weakness. Sometimes it's a signal that you're pushing too hard, chasing perfection instead of progress. When I finally admitted, yes, I broke my promise, something strange happened. I stopped hiding from it. I stopped pretending I was fine. And that small act of honesty, that tiny surrender, was the first real step forward. Because maybe to keep growing, you need to first forgive yourself for falling. The winter of silence. Winter in Denmark isn't just cold. It's quiet. The streets look frozen, the sky hangs low, and sometimes it feels like even time slows down to shiver. That first winter, I barely spoke to anyone. Not because people weren't kind, but because silence felt safer than embarrassment. I remember sitting in my tiny apartment, the window fogged up, watching snow fall on the same streetlight every night. I'd open my English notebook, repeat sentences out loud, and then stop halfway, afraid my voice might sound wrong, foreign, broken. The silence became my comfort zone. But comfort can be dangerous when you're trying to grow. Language isn't learned through silence. It's born in mistakes. Yet my fear of sounding stupid turned every conversation into a battlefield inside my head. Scientists call this the amygdala hijack, when your brain's fear center takes over logic. It's the same reaction as facing a wild animal. Except in my case, the wild animal was a Danish barista asking, "Do you want milk with that?" Funny, isn't it? How your mind can make a simple question feel like an exam. But that's what happens when shame sneaks into learning. You don't just lose words, you lose the courage to use them. I started avoiding eye contact, skipping social events, convincing myself that being quiet was just my personality. But deep down I knew it wasn't. It was fear dressed as calmness. Then one night, while walking home under falling snow, I heard two kids laughing in English. Their words weren't perfect. Their accents were thick. But they were free, laughing, learning, living. I remember whispering to myself, "That's what I want again. Not perfection, just freedom." And that was the moment I realized silence wasn't peace. It was a prison built out of fear. Talking to walls. There was a time in Denmark when my only English conversation partner was the wall. Yes, literally. Every morning I stood in front of the mirror and tried to talk about the weather, about my breakfast, about nothing important at all. First it felt ridiculous. I even laughed at myself. But then I noticed something strange. The wall never judged me. When you talk to a wall, you realize that your biggest fear isn't making mistakes. It's being heard making them. The wall doesn't raise an eyebrow, doesn't giggle, doesn't interrupt with, "Sorry, what did you mean?" Just listens. And in that quiet, judgment-free space, my English started to come alive again. There's actually science behind this. Psychologists call it exposure therapy. Facing your fear little by little, until your brain learns it's not dangerous. So each day I gave the wall a new topic. One day I told it about my hometown in Vietnam. Another day, I described the feeling of Danish wind against my face. My pronunciation improved, my sentences flowed faster, and I even began to enjoy hearing my own voice in English. But here's the funny part. Once my Danish neighbor walked past my door while I was passionately explaining climate change to the wall. Later that week he asked, smiling, "Are you teaching someone English?" I almost died of embarrassment. But instead of hiding, I laughed and said, "Yes, myself." And just like that, I had my first real conversation in weeks. That's when I learned something priceless. Practice doesn't have to look pretty. You don't need a classroom, or a perfect partner, or courage that never shakes. You just need to show up, even if your only audience is a wall. Because every word you speak, even to no one, builds a bridge back to confidence. The Café Test. One rainy morning in Aarhus, I decided to test myself. No more hiding, no more walls. I put on my thick jacket, walked down the cobblestone street, and stepped into a cozy little cafe near the train station. The air smelled like cinnamon and fresh coffee and fear. My fear that I'd planned everything in my head. "Hi, can I get a cappuccino, please?" Simple, right? But as I stood at the counter, my brain betrayed me. Words got tangled, my mouth went dry, and all I managed to say was a nervous, "Coffee, please." The barista smiled kindly, nodded, and replied, "Cappuccino." I froze, then nodded too fast like a malfunctioning robot. But something unexpected happened. She didn't laugh. She didn't look confused. She just made the coffee, handed it to me, and said, "You speak very clearly." That single sentence felt like a sunrise inside my chest. It wasn't just about the compliment, it was proof that communication doesn't have to be perfect to be real. That day, I learned the most powerful truth in language learning. Your goal isn't to speak without mistakes. It's to connect despite them, so I kept going back to that cafe. Every week a new test. One day I asked about the pastries. Another time I complimented the playlist. Slowly I built a tiny world where English wasn't a burden. It was a bridge, and here's something science backs up. Every time you face a fear and succeed, even just a little, your brain releases dopamine, the confidence chemical. It's like your mind saying, "See? You didn't die. And that tiny reward system rewires how you see fear. The cafe became my classroom, and the sound of milk frothing became the soundtrack of my recovery. Sometimes, courage doesn't roar. It just whispers, "One cappuccino, please." Why promises break? Have you ever noticed how easy it is to make promises when you're inspired? And how quietly they fall apart when real life kicks in? That's the strange psychology of motivation. When I first promised to speak English every day, I wasn't lying. I meant it. But I didn't understand how fragile motivation really is when it meets fear, fatigue, and self-doubt. According to behavioral scientists, our brains are wired for short-term rewards. That's why keeping a long-term promise, like mastering English, feels exhausting. Your brain wants a dopamine hit now, not 6 months later when you can finally understand Netflix without subtitles. So when progress is slow, it whispers, "Why bother?" That whisper is powerful. It starts as procrastination and ends as guilt. And guilt is heavy. You start thinking, if I already failed once, why try again? That's the moment most promises die, not because we're lazy, but because we mistake a pause for a failure. When I realized this, everything changed. I stopped calling myself unmotivated. Instead, I started calling myself human. It sounds small, but it's huge. You see, breaking promises isn't a moral flaw. It's a signal that your system needs adjusting. Maybe your goal was too big. Maybe your plan didn't fit your real life, so I built what I call the 3-minute rule. Every day, I promise to practice English for just 3 minutes. No pressure, no perfection, just 3 honest minutes. Some days I stopped at 3. Most days I kept going for 30. But the difference was this: the promise felt light enough to keep. Keeping promises to yourself is like lifting weights. Start too heavy and you'll quit. Start light and you'll grow stronger every day. So if you've broken your promise to learn English, don't feel ashamed. Maybe that promise just needs to be rewritten, not as a punishment but as an invitation. Because a broken promise doesn't mean a broken person. It just means you're still learning how to keep it your way. Rebuilding with small wins. There's something magical about doing one small thing right after everything has fallen apart. It's like lighting a tiny candle in a dark room. It doesn't change the darkness completely, but it reminds you that you can still create light. That's how I rebuilt my confidence in English, not through grand goals, but through small wins. First, I stopped focusing on fluency. I focused on moments. One successful greeting, one clear sentence, one friendly reply that didn't feel forced. Every tiny success was like a quiet cheer inside my brain. And science actually supports this. Dopamine, the chemical of motivation, doesn't just appear after big victories. It fires every time your brain notices progress. It's basically your mind saying, "Hey, that worked. Do it again." So I built rituals around small wins. Each morning I read one short English quote out loud. At lunch, I ordered food in English, even if the waiter understood Danish better. In the evening, I repeated one phrase I'd heard that day, slowly, clearly, proudly. And guess what? I began to enjoy it. The fear that once froze my voice started to fade, replaced by small bursts of curiosity and even fun. It turns out, consistency is far more powerful than intensity. One day, after chatting easily with a tourist couple in Copenhagen, I walked home smiling like an idiot, not because my English was perfect, but because I realized I didn't even think about it. It just flowed. That's what small wins do. They make success automatic. They retrain your brain to expect effort, not fear. If you're struggling with English, try this. Stop chasing perfection. Chase progress you can feel. Ask one question. Read one paragraph. Record one voice note. That's how confidence grows, one honest attempt at a time. Because language learning isn't about how fast you go. It's about how long you stay. And small wins are what keep you walking. Here's something they don't teach in language school. Your confidence has chemistry. Literally. Every time you keep a promise to yourself, even a tiny one, your brain releases a quiet cocktail of dopamine and serotonin. These are the trust chemicals. They whisper, "You did what you said you'd do." And that whisper, repeated often enough, becomes self-trust. But when you break a promise, like skipping that English practice for the 10th time, your brain does the opposite. It learns that your words can't be trusted, not by others but by you. That's why starting again feels so hard. You're not just rebuilding a skill, you're repairing a relationship with yourself. When I understood this, everything about learning English changed. It wasn't about vocabulary lists or pronunciation drills anymore. It was about trust reps, tiny actions that rebuild the connection between my words and my willpower. Neuroscientists call this the consistency loop. The more often you act on what you say, the more your prefrontal cortex, the decision-making part of your brain, learns to override fear. Basically, the brain goes, "Oh, this person does what they say. I can relax now." And suddenly, speaking English in front of strangers doesn't feel like skydiving anymore. One day, I realized I had reached that point. I was in a train station, helping a lost tourist find the right platform. I spoke clearly, smiled naturally, and when he said, "Your English is really good," I didn't blush or freeze. I just said, "Thanks. I've practiced a lot." And I meant it. That small exchange proves something science has been saying all along. Confidence isn't born, it's built neuron by neuron, promise by promise. So if you've lost faith in yourself, don't try to rebuild it with motivation. Rebuild it with evidence. Keep one tiny promise today, and let your brain remember how trust feels. Because fluency begins long before the words. It begins with believing your voice is worth hearing. The last promise I made wasn't about English. It wasn't even about success. It was about honesty with myself. I promised that no matter how slow, how imperfect, or how messy my progress looked, I would keep showing up. Not to impress anyone, not to prove anything, but because learning, for me, had become an act of self-respect. One evening in Copenhagen, I sat by the canal watching the sunset ripple over the water. A group of students nearby were laughing in English. Their accents were different, Danish, German, maybe Spanish, but their joy sounded the same. For the first time, I didn't compare myself. I didn't think, "They're better than me." I just listened and smiled. That's when it hit me. Broken promises don't make broken people. They make honest people. People who've learned what doesn't work and who dare to start again anyway. The real courage isn't in never breaking a promise. It's in keeping your heart open enough to make another one. So here's my last promise: to keep learning, to keep failing beautifully, and to keep forgiving myself when I stumble. Because in the end, fluency isn't just about words. It's about finding your voice again after silence. If you're watching this and you've lost hope, maybe you've tried 100 times to learn English, maybe you're tired of your own excuses, just remember, you don't need a new language to change your life. You just need one promise that you're brave enough to keep. Point 1 word today, 2 tomorrow, a full sentence next week. That's how voices are born. And maybe one day you'll look back like I did and realize that the promise you thought you broke was simply leading you here.